Good afternoon. Today we're coming to you from the historic St. Ambrose Episcopal Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. And with us today is our iconic St. Ambrose member, the recently retired Chief of Police from the Raleigh City, Miss Cassandra Brown. Cassandra, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm here on behalf of the Episcopal Laymen to meet with Cassandra, to ask her some questions. We wanted to focus on her as one of the focus of people for our newsletter, our monthly newsletter. So Cassandra, I'm going to start with a few questions here. I'm going to throw you a softball question so you can knock it out of the park. Do you consider yourself a cradle to grave Episcopalian, and why?
I would say yes, but probably by way of a rather unique circumstance. My mother was Episcopalian and my father was Baptist. My mother was from Philadelphia and my father is a native of North Carolina. So after the war, he meets my mom and they moved down south. And in Franklin County, I attended basically through the school year the Baptist church that my father was a member of and was very active there. And during the summer months, all the way through college, we visited Philadelphia and visited with my mother's family there and grandparents. And there I attended the Episcopal Church.
That's interesting. I was a Baptist before also. Let's talk about your spiritual journey and how your Episcopal faith has helped you through the challenges in your professional life.
I've leaned extremely hard on my faith in God. And I would say it's not just been through my career, but throughout my life. As I mentioned, I was very active in our church. And as a young child, you participated in all the different programs. And growing up through that, I was very active in youth events and activities all the way through my adulthood. And so by the time I joined the Raleigh Police Department in 1987, I was already entrenched in my faith. Mm-hmm. And I would say that over the course of that career, my faith has only grown stronger. And when you are faced, as you mentioned, with challenges, you lean, at least I have, leaned extremely hard and towards my faith. And very often in some of my very public presentations and speeches and comments, I was very quick to say, I start my day on my knees and I end my day on my knees. And that was so true throughout the course of my career. As you know, my public life has been very, very public and an open book, but in many instances, so has my private life. Mm-hmm. And one has impacted the other in a number of ways. And so I have been blessed to have my family, to have friends, to have my faith community, my church members to truly support me. And I know that I have been lifted in prayer throughout the course of that career, and particularly in those times where life has been most public. And so I would say that I am extremely grounded in my faith.
That is absolutely so good to hear. You know, several years ago, I recall that you made a trip to Jerusalem, I believe.
I did.
How did that experience play a part in your spiritual journey?
Oh, it had a significant place in my spiritual journey. Not many people are aware, but I went to Israel for law enforcement purposes. It was all work related. And so for 15 days, it was really an exchange program, really involving and educating them in a lot of ways, their law enforcement agency, but we learned from them also. But the key purpose of that trip was to really discuss community policing and what that could look like in Israel, and giving them the opportunity to share with them what it looks like in Raleigh. So they had never heard of Raleigh before, but to be able to share with them some of the things that we were doing was phenomenal. On the weekends, we had the opportunity to experience things on a more personal note. We would work for part of the day, and then in the evenings, we had the opportunity to visit places in the Holy Land. And, to see places and read about places in the Bible, and to know that you are standing in that space just is tremendously gratifying and very often surreal in a lot of ways. And so to be grounded in my faith, and know that I had the opportunity to stand at the Sea of Galilee, to know that I had the opportunity to rededicate my baptismal faith in the River Jordan, and it is chilly and cold in the middle of 100 and some degree temperature. But to also stand in what is deemed the holiest place on earth by many, in the old city of Jerusalem, and to walk the streets where Jesus walked prior to his crucifixion, and to see where his tomb is, and to touch it as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre sits on Mount Calvary. To stand at the Western Wall, which is where many of the Jewish faith stand, and then to stand and see the Great Mosque, all within a very short proximity of each other, was just a very surreal moment. And so I found myself not only reviewing and reading the work-related things, but every place that I would visit, I would then go back and reevaluate a notation I had made, or go back and read a point in the Bible, and just really try and connect those points. And particularly while I was, we did a lot of this traveling on pretty much a charter bus. And so as we would go from one point to the other, there was time to review and recall and read about, where I had just stood, Masada, the Dead Sea, the Red Sea, and to stand there at the northernmost tip of Israel, Haifa, and then to be at the southernmost tip, and you are literally in the Red Sea, and it is a phenomenal experience.
It really sounds like a one-in-a-lifetime experience that few people, if I can say, really ever have the opportunity to experience. So it's wonderful you were able to do that. Let me just ask you, what is it that really brings you joy? Can you share a personal example of that?
I would say from an interpersonal standpoint, what probably brings me the most joy is just peace and tranquility. Unconditional love from family and friends. I am very practical in those things that bring me joy, and very simplistic in that regard. Joy, I think, comes in a lot of ways. Some are more public than they are than personal. I would say in the last 3 to 4 months, the greatest joy I've had is retirement. And to have the blessing of completing a a 34-year career in law enforcement, and to see it change and evolve over the course of time, and clearly knowing the impact that 2020 had on everyone, be it the pandemic, be it the protest, our personal lives. Many people have lost family members due to the pandemic, and just a year of stressors that peaked and valleyed over time. To be able to still not only deal with those things that were so public, but to still keep the work of the Raleigh Police Department going forward, and remaining humble throughout all of that, and having the opportunity to retire. In many instances, I would say, on my terms, and know and recognize that that is indeed a blessing. Joy has come in sometimes, I won't say odd to me, but perhaps interesting to some others who have been present when I have just been in the presence of strangers who have said, I'm praying for you. I lift you up in prayer. You're on our prayer list, and so forth. That's a joy that you can't necessarily measure. You can't necessarily put a value on it, but that's joy.
Well, speaking of retirement, what basically, how are you spending your time during your retirement right now?
I think for the last 30-some years, it has been nonstop. And then in the role as chief, you find yourself, and I've had staff members to say, we go full force all the time. You're running at 100 miles an hour, managing a police department here in the capital city of this state. It's not an easy feat. And so being able to retire, I haven't come to a complete stop. So I'm not at a screeching halt by any means. I would say that I pump my brakes very often, and so I'm exploring what the new normal is, and looking at possibilities and opportunities, because I do think that there is still a tremendous amount of service and service work to still do. And so I look forward to what that takes shape, how that takes shape, and what that looks like, and continuing to grow. You know, I don't see retirement as a closed door. I see it almost as a passageway into my next venture, the next endeavor. And how I can still be engaged in the community. I think this is a tremendous time for law enforcement in the community to really assess what change can look like. I think we are starting to see, as crime increases and a number of other things, that there is a purpose for law enforcement. But it comes with change, and there needs to be change. And so I'm hoping and exploring, you know, what opportunities are still out there for me to still become and remain engaged in that new change going forward. The 21st century, I think, affords us a lot, particularly with what 2020 presented us with, and even as we are still navigating through a pandemic, we're all faced with new normals. I think from a professional standpoint, and from a personal standpoint, and from a spiritual standpoint.
Yeah, just to delve into just a tidbit and follow up on what you just said, have you given any thought to how you can further impact the St. Ambrose family's place in the community?
Absolutely. You know, having served in a city for 34 years as a public servant, your time, your energy doesn't stop because you finally ended your professional career. So I anticipate, as I always have here in this church, being a servant within the walls of this house of worship, but also through outreach efforts in our greater community. So I'm looking forward to that. I know that 2020, as I mentioned, presented us with a very different perspective on how we gather, how we worship, how we socially distance ourselves from others and still stay healthy and safe. And one of the last projects and initiatives that I did before I left the police department was I started a team that's called the I Care team, which is the Interfaith Community Ambassadors for Responsive Engagement. And they are a collective of faith leaders throughout the city of Raleigh. And they reflect different denominations, from Buddhist to Baptist to Baha'i, all walks, all faiths, to come together to look at how we can greater serve our community. Now, while I'm not there, that relationship has still remained intact. And so I look forward to serving an even more diverse community in my retirement capacity. So my work is not done. I think, like many of us, we have to look to see what outreach continues to look like in this environment that we're in. But the work still has to be done. People are still in need. People are still hopeful. And I think that I have more to give.
Well, it's certainly wonderful to hear that you're going to continue to be engaged in the community. That's great. Let me ask just one last question, if I may. What is something that most people don't know about you?
I think you've kind of hit on one of those questions, on that point. A lot of people did not know, other than my St. Ambrose family, that I had gone to Israel. So that is probably a pivotal point in my life that many did not know about. I'm not real sure. So much of my life has been such an open book in this space and time. But you know what I will say, and I think most people know this, but I will say it, that having been one of a few women in the role that I've had as a police chief, and remained very grounded in my faith throughout that very busy and public career. One thing that has been important to me is to remain humble in all of that. So I think people know that. And so that will be one of the things that I will continue to strive to do and be as I remain in some way a servant leader and one of God's servants.
Well, Cassandra, you certainly have been a tremendous servant to this community, and we certainly treasure your presence here at St. Ambrose. And I think it was germane and proper that on this iconic day, September 11th, I had the opportunity to interview one of our icons here at St. Ambrose. So thank you for your time. And I want to thank Karen Thomas, our videographer, for doing this today, and Carl Harper for helping with all that he's done as well. With that, Thank you again.
Thank you. It was my honor, and I once again am very grateful for my St. Ambrose Episcopal Church family and the greater community and my family to just be a part of this space.
Thank you. We'll leave it there.